I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm with a mentor of really everybody in the field, Professor Deborah Dash Moore, the Frederick G.L. Heatwell Professor of History at the University of Michigan, someone who has taught us so much about New York Jewish history. Her series won the National Jewish Book Award for that three-part series, and then eventually was synthesized into a single volume, which is critically important. Someone then who's also taught us about the Jewish experience in Florida and California, talked about urbanization, suburbanization. But today I want to talk about GI Jews, because what, Deborah, you identified, not necessarily first in the larger field of World War II studies, but certainly in our field of American Jewish history, is how important the military is as an arena to understand the limits of pluralism, of openness, of tolerance for Jews in the United States.
So thank you for that introduction. And yes, I did come to write about Jewish experience in the military, I think in part because of where I was situated. That is to say, I am someone who grew up in the years after World War II and had the benefits of what those years produced in terms of the changes that it made in the experience of well over 500,000 American Jews who served in the military. I've often said to people when they've asked, how did I get interested in this particular topic? I told them about these 50th anniversary celebrations in 1995 of the end of the war, and the way in which those celebrations looked at the victory that was the American victory over Nazism, over fascism, over the Japanese. And on the other hand, there was this Jewish terrible tragedy, right? I mean, it was the Holocaust. That's what those war years meant. And I was thinking about myself as an American Jew. So where do I fit? Am I mourning or am I celebrating? And I realized that I wasn't alone, that the experience of my father as a soldier, he was served in the Navy, and actually I did interview him for the book, so he's in the book. His experience was typical, not atypical, so that there was this whole other story about American Jews that was neither Holocaust Jewish nor completely celebration American, but was different. And I realized that how to get at that story was going to be a real challenge. So I did an oral history first with my father, and thought, you know, if he'll tell me, his daughter, something serious, because he'd only told us funny stories, he'd tell me something serious, then I would realize I could maybe get at this. And he did. He told me something serious. And then I went to a group of his buddies. They were all from Brooklyn. And I interviewed all of them. And that was where it began. And I would tell people that, you know, I had a wonderful editor at Harvard University Press. And I said, I'm going to do a book on, you know, from Brooklyn boys, you know, to the front, right, kind of thing. Because they all served in all the different branches, you know, Army, Navy, Air Corps, you know, you name it, right? And she said, Deborah, no, you can't do that. You know, you have to cross the Hudson River. You have to do the rest of the U.S. because nobody else is going to do it, and this is the moment. And of course, she was right in terms of the ages of the men and, you know, what one could do. They were in their 70s, and so, you know, 10 years later, the book appeared. And I think one of the things that I discovered in the book was the distinctiveness in this common experience. Everyone wore the same uniform. But beneath the uniform, there was a different experience for American Jews. And that was what I was trying to get at in the book.
And it was an experience that was fraught with tension, of understanding the import of World War II for their own experience, the Holocaust side, and also understanding how people did look at the uniform, but they also looked underneath where there was a certain coding. People were coded in such a way. If you had a Jewish name, that looked different in the military to a non-Jew, and understanding that network of experiences.
Right. So one of the big things that I discovered, of course, is that anti-Semitism was widespread in the military, right? And that does have to do with the names that was, on each soldier's ID. And it also had to do with the choice of putting an H on the dog tag. The H stood for Hebrew, which was what you did if you were Jewish. There was no J at that time. Later, nowadays, there's a J. J comes in the early 1950s. But you had an H on your dog tag. And that was sort of the external sign, along with your name, that you were actually a Jew, right, underneath the uniform. And that meant, because of anti-Semitism, and, I would point out to students and others that this is not an exclusive prejudice, right? The military was segregated, so there certainly was anti-Black sentiment. There was anti-Asian sentiment. There was anti-Mexican Americans, Italian Americans. I mean, the ethnic prejudices throughout the military were quite profound. But for many Jews, although they certainly knew about anti-Semitism, they hadn't figured out how they were going to deal with it when it was coming from people that with whom they were living, and whom they had to trust, especially if they were in the infantry, right? I mean, you had to trust the guys behind you, and so you had to be confident that they didn't hate you. Because after all, they had weapons and they could just as easily miss and kill you. So this becomes something that's really a challenge. I have a story in there from a guy named Paul Steinfeld, who describes an encounter that he has. He's in the infantry, and he's still stateside, and he's shaving, which is why obviously my hand went up to my chin. And thinking about this. So he's standing next to another guy shaving, and the guy turns to him, he says, Steiny, because that was his nickname. He says, Steiny, how come you're in the infantry? Right? I thought all of your race was in the quartermaster's corps. So Steinfeld is furious. He drops his razor and he's ready to fight. Now, you got to know, of course, that the Quartermaster's Corps is behind the lines. The Quartermaster's Corps supplies the troops. The infantry is on the front lines. They're the ones who face the most likelihood of getting killed. It is the most dangerous position in the military. So Steinfeld's ready to fight, and the other guy, who's a Southerner, he steps back. He said, well, I never met a Jew before, right? And then he repeats it. I thought all of your race was in the Quartermaster's Corps. And so Steinfeld decides, all right, maybe this guy is educatable. Maybe he could explain. And so he says, look, it's a stupid question. Right? I'm standing here right next to you in the infantry. What do you mean, right? And then he goes on to say, and we're not a race. Right? He's trying to get across that, yes, Jews may be different, but they're not a race. This was something that Steinfeld encountered repeatedly. I mean, he encountered anti-Semitism when he was, overseas as well in the European theater. So it's an ongoing sort of second battle that these Jewish men have to fight. They have to fight the actual enemy, and especially when they get overseas, and the enemy is Germans, they're aware that they're targeted not just as American soldiers, but also as Jews, right? But then they have to fight this other enemy, which is to say the prejudices of their own comrades in the military. And that's very difficult because there was nothing that prepared them for this. You grow up, it's an anti-Semitic society. There's all kinds of discrimination against Jews. You can't get jobs here. You can't go into this hotel there. You're discriminated against in college and university admissions. I mean, all of this as a teenager, right? Because that's how young many of these men were as a teenager growing up. But that's not the same thing as having to deal with it internally. So that's one of the big changes. Now, to be fair to the military, I have to add that the H on the dog tag meant that Jews were one of three categories. You could put an H, you could put a P for Protestant, or you could put a C for Catholic. Those were the three religious groups that were recognized, right? Or you could have nothing. And that gave Judaism a ranking on the same level as Catholics and Protestants. And the military carried through with that. They had chapels that didn't have any distinguishing signs, so they could be used by Jews, they could be used by Catholics, they could be used by Protestants. When they had memorial services, they had a Protestant chaplain, a Jewish chaplain, and a Catholic chaplain, all of them together. All the chaplains were required to report on what they did for men who were not of their own faith. That was part of their monthly reporting to the military. So there were these two sides. There was both anti-Semitism, but also recognition of Judaism as one of the three fighting faiths of democracy.
And what about for American Jews who weren't fighting in the war? What did it mean for particularly women, I suppose, and children, anybody who really wasn't involved in the war effort, that there was Jewish soldiering in World War II?
So I think you need to think of this on several levels. Certainly on a personal level, when you have over 500,000 American Jews serving in the military, that means there is not a single Jewish family that doesn't have someone, right? A brother, a father, an uncle, a cousin, right? I mean, you name it, who's in the service. That means they have someone whom they care about very, who have a personal connection with, they care about deeply who's there, and they worry about, is that person going to survive, right? So that's one concern and response. For others, Jews on the home front, if you step back and you think about it in terms of the community, there are general ways in which Jews, just like their neighbors, saved scrap, bought savings, war bonds, did things in order to help the war effort, right? And then there were also the specific Jewish concerns about what was happening to Jews under Hitler's Germany in the concentration camps, in the ghettos, and then later when they hear midway through the war about the death camps. So that kind of news depended to a certain extent on what kind of a Jew you were in the US, right? Were you a religious Jew? Were you a politically engaged Jew, perhaps on the left, perhaps as a Zionist? Where, you know, those positions helped to shape how you heard the news, how you interpreted the news, what you did in response to the news. So there's a good deal of variety that complements the sort of personal connection. And, you know, I should say, look, in one of the volumes you mentioned of the New York City of Promises trilogy, right, that came out, Jeffrey Gurrock writes about people he interviewed who are a group of women, some with husbands, but many with husbands in the military, who go up to the Catskills, right? And they're enjoying themselves, even though it's World War II. And that went on as well, right? People had weddings, people had bar mitzvahs, right? Those things also happened on the home front.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.